If Jesus did not come back to life, then Christianity wouldn't be true, the Bible wouldn't be reliable, and our faith wouldn't have a real foundation. Now that sounds serious, but the Bible itself says this. Because if Jesus did rise from the dead, then everything he taught is true. This is not about feelings. It's not about guessing. It's not about believing without thinking. It comes down to one big question. Did Jesus really rise from the dead? In this video, we will look at that question step by step. First, we will talk about the empty tomb and why even the enemies of Jesus agreed it was empty. Next, we'll look outside the Bible and see what Roman and Jewish historians said about Jesus' death and what happened after. Then, we'll learn about the eyewitnesses, people who said they saw Jesus alive again and were willing to suffer or die for what they saw. We will also talk about people who didn't believe in Jesus at first, but later changed and became his followers. Finally, we'll ask one important question. What explanation best explains all the facts? Every resurrection claim, no matter who makes it, rises or falls on one question. Was the tomb empty? All four Gospels agree on this central point. The tomb was empty on the third day. But here's what's important. The strongest evidence for the empty tomb does not come from Jesus' followers or his disciples. It comes from his enemies. If the body of Jesus was still in the tomb, the authorities could have ended the resurrection message immediately. They could have produced the body. They could have shut everything down. And Christianity would have died right there in Jerusalem. But that's not what happened. After the resurrection of Jesus, Jerusalem woke to a problem the religious leaders did not anticipate. The tomb was empty, and there was no body to produce. According to Matthew chapter 28, the first people to report what happened were not the disciples of Jesus, but the Roman guards themselves. These soldiers had been stationed at the tomb precisely to prevent any claim of resurrection. Their presence meant the authorities expected something and wanted control over the outcome. The guards came trembling, reporting that there was an earthquake. An angel appeared. The stone was rolled away, and they were powerless to control the situation. This put the chief priest and elders in a crisis. If the guards' testimony became public, it would confirm supernatural intervention, divine authority, and worst of all, the resurrection of Jesus. So the leaders gathered in council and made a calculated decision. Rather than investigate the evidence, they constructed an alternative explanation. They bribed the soldiers and instructed them to say, "His disciples came at night and stole him away while we slept." This story was deeply flawed, but politically useful. Sleeping on duty was punishable by death for Roman soldiers, yet the leaders promised to protect the guards from punishment. Another clue that this was not a genuine report, but a manufactured narrative. The irony is striking. If the guards were asleep, How could they know who stole the body? Still, the story served its purpose. Matthew tells us, and this saying is commonly reported among the Jews until this day. The lie did not triumph because it was convincing, but because it was repeated. The resurrection was not rejected for lack of evidence, but because accepting it required repentance, humility, and surrender. So the empty tomb was explained away, not by truth, but by fear of what the truth would demand. Think about that. That explanation already admits the tomb was empty. You don't explain away a body that's still there. Now notice what the authorities did not say. They never claimed the body was moved to another tomb for safety. They never argued that Jesus had only fainted and later revived. They never tried to prove that Jesus was still dead. Why? Because they couldn't. Everyone, friends and enemies alike, knew two things were true. Jesus had really died, and the tomb was now empty. So instead of denying the facts, the authorities did something else. They admitted the body was gone and rushed to invent an explanation. They needed a story to control the damage. And here's the key point. Cover stories don't create facts. They only exist because the facts are already there. If there had been no empty tomb, there would have been no need for a cover story. The very attempt to explain the missing body proves the problem was real. So in trying to hide the truth, they ended up confirming it. So let's slow down and really test the official explanation. First, Roman guards were placed at the tomb. These were not volunteers or casual watchmen. They were trained soldiers under strict military law. If a Roman guard fell asleep while on duty, the punishment could be death. So soldiers did not casually admit, "Oh, we fell asleep." If they said they slept, it would only be because someone paid them to say it. That already tells us the story is suspicious. Second, the tomb was sealed with Roman authority. That seal was a legal warning from the Roman government. Breaking it was a serious crime, often punishable by death. This wasn't a paper sticker. It represented Rome's power. A group of unarmed fishermen would not dare break a Roman seal. Overpowered trained soldiers move a heavy stone and then escape without anyone noticing. That simply doesn't match reality. Third, the disciples were not brave men at this point. They were hiding. They had run away when Jesus was arrested. Peter had even denied knowing Jesus. They were afraid of being arrested next. Fearful men don't suddenly become bold grave robbers overnight. Cowards don't risk their lives for a plan they don't believe in. And finally, these men later went out and boldly preached one message: Jesus is risen. They were beaten, they were imprisoned, many of them were killed. They gained no money, no power, and no comfort from this message. People may die for something they think is true, but people do not willingly suffer and die for something they know is false. The simplest explanation is this: The tomb was empty because Jesus really rose from the dead. All four Gospels agree on one surprising detail: women. Women were the first to find the empty tomb. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, written independently, each say that women went to the tomb early that morning and discovered it was empty. Their names vary slightly, but the main point is the same. That detail matters because in the first century world, women were not seen as reliable witnesses. Their testimony carried little legal or public weight. So if the resurrection story had been made up, this is the last detail anyone would include. The disciples could have named respected men, religious leaders, or public figures to make the story more convincing. But they didn't. They reported what actually happened, even though it made their message harder to believe in their culture. Including women doesn't help propaganda. It shows honesty. The gospel writers weren't trying to persuade by polishing the story. They simply wrote down what happened. That's what you expect from a real event, not a made-up myth. Jesus was not buried in a secret place. He was placed in a well-known tomb owned by Joseph of Arimathea, a respected member of the Jewish council. This is important because Joseph was not a distant follower. He was part of the same leadership group that condemned Jesus. His tomb was known, identifiable, and easy to find. Everyone knew where Jesus was buried: his friends, his enemies, the religious authorities. There was no confusion or mystery about the burial place. Anyone, believer or skeptic, could go and check the tomb. And that leads to something crucial. The message that Jesus had risen did not appear years later or in another city. It began immediately, and it began in Jerusalem. Jerusalem was the worst place to make up a resurrection story. Jesus was executed there. The tomb was there. The body could have been shown to stop the message. If the tomb had not been empty, the resurrection claim would have ended at once. All the authorities had to do was show the body, but they never did. The burial place made the claim public, testable, and open to verification, and it still stood. That's not how legends are created. That's how real history is challenged and survives. The resurrection of Jesus was not proclaimed generations later, after memories had faded and facts could no longer be checked. It was preached immediately, just weeks after the crucifixion, while the events were still fresh and emotions still raw. In the very city where Jesus had been executed, Peter stood up publicly in Jerusalem and declared with boldness, "This Jesus God raised up, of which we are all witnesses." That statement was not made in a private gathering or to sympathetic listeners. It was made openly to the same population that had witnessed the crucifixion. And notice what did not happen. No official interruption, no public refutation, no body brought forward to end the message. The authorities did not produce or respond by producing the remains of Jesus because they couldn't. If the tomb had not been empty, Peter's sermon would have ended instantly. The movement would have been stopped at its birth. One piece of physical evidence would have silenced the claim forever. But nothing was produced. Instead, the preaching continued, the message spread, and thousands responded. That silence is not accidental. It is telling. The absence of a rebuttal, when one was both possible and expected, speaks louder than words. The early proclamation of the resurrection, in the very place where it could be most easily disproven, confirms that the tomb was already empty. This is not the behavior of people defending a myth. It is the confidence of witnesses who knew the evidence could not contradict them. The conclusion is simple. If Jesus' body had still been in the tomb, Christianity would have ended immediately. The leaders could have pointed to the grave, shown the body, and stopped the message on day one. But that never happened. Instead, the tomb was empty. And once the tomb is empty, the real question isn't if something happened, it's what happened. An empty tomb demands an explanation. The disciples didn't gain money, power, or safety by preaching the resurrection. They gained suffering, rejection, and death. People don't die for something they know is a lie. History doesn't point to a body in the tomb. It points to a body that was missing and never found. Because the tomb was empty, the resurrection of Jesus cannot be brushed aside. History doesn't side with rumors or silence. It sides with the empty tomb. In short, Jesus' enemies admitted the tomb was empty. Authorities spread a cover story. Guards were bribed. The body was never produced. The empty tomb is not Christian propaganda, Par. It is historical bedrock. Now, let's step outside the Bible. One of the most respected Roman historians was Publius Cornelius Tacitus, usually referred to simply as Tacitus. He was a Roman senator and an official historian of the empire. He hated Christianity, and that's why what he says matters. Tacitus wrote around AD 116. He was not a Christian and had no reason to defend Christianity. Yet he confirms key facts. Jesus was a real person. Jesus was executed by crucifixion, and he was condemned by Pontius Pilate. This happened during the reign of Tiberius Caesar. All of this matches with the gospel, with what the gospels say. But Tacitus adds something important. He says the movement did not end after Jesus died. Instead of disappearing, the followers of Jesus grew stronger and spread quickly. That is unexpected. Crucifixion was meant to stop movements. Usually when a leader was executed, followers gave up and scattered. That did not happen here. This is not Christian preaching. This is not church tradition. This is Roman history, written by the enemy of Christianity, or an enemy of Christianity. Tacitus shows that Christianity didn't start as a legend told later. It began with real events that even Rome could not deny. When the Roman historian Tacitus wrote about what happened after Jesus was executed, he used a striking phrase. He said the movement was checked for a moment. That simply means it was stopped briefly. From Rome's perspective, Christianity, that movement, should have ended at the cross. That's how executions worked. Kill the leader and the movement dies with him. But that did not happen. Tacitus says the movement broke out again. It didn't fade away. It did not disappear. It came back stronger and more widespread than before. Rome was skilled at crushing movements. When a leader was executed, followers usually scattered in fear, and the message died. Christianity did not. It is the only known movement in ancient history that grew rapidly after its leader was publicly executed. Something happened between the cross and the sudden growth of the church. Something powerful enough to turn fear into courage and silence into bold preaching. That one phrase from Tacitus forces history to ask a question the Gospels already answer. Why did this movement rise when it should have died? When Tacitus wrote about Christianity, he was not being kind. He called it a mischievous superstition. That shows he did not like Christianity and was not trying to support it. And that is exactly why his words matter. People who dislike movement don't make up stories to help it. They don't invent miracles or resurrections. They only record facts they cannot ignore. Tacitus had every reason to dismiss Christianity as dangerous or foolish. Yet he still confirms three key facts. Jesus was executed. The movement did not die. It spread quickly after his death. He does not explain why it survived. He only admits that it did. That is important. When an enemy admits basic facts, it means those facts were already well known and impossible to deny. Tacitus was not defending Christianity. He was simply recording what happened. And what he recorded forces history to face one truth. Something powerful happened, something strong enough to keep Christianity alive even when Rome wanted it dead. If Jesus had stayed dead, fear would have ended everything. The disciples had already run away once. They were hiding. They were confused. They were scared. And fear should have won. Rome was very good at stopping movements. It had the soldiers, the laws, and the experience. Many leaders claimed big things, and when they died, their movements died with them. Jesus should have been forgotten, but that did not happen. Instead, the movement grew fast. Worship became stronger, not weaker. People didn't run away. They came together. Persecution didn't silence the message. It spread it. Something changed fear into courage. Something changed silence into bold preaching. Something turned a defeated group into a movement Rome could not stop. History can tell us what happened, but it cannot explain why it happened. The resurrection does. It explains the courage, it explains the growth, the worship, why persecution failed. The resurrection explains what history alone cannot. One of the strongest arguments for the resurrection doesn't come from an outsider. It doesn't come from a stranger, a follower, or even an early preacher. It comes from someone who, by all accounts, should never have believed. James, the brother of Jesus. James grew up with Jesus. He knew him long before the miracles, long before the crowds ever gathered, before anyone was calling Jesus the Messiah, and long before the cross. And the Gospels tell us something that's both uncomfortable and deeply honest. Even the brothers of Jesus did not believe in him. If anyone had reason not to believe Jesus was the Messiah, it was his own family. James watched Jesus grow up. He knew his daily habits. He saw his ordinary life. He knew his humanity up close. And yet, during the public ministry of Jesus, James remained a skeptic. No devotion, no public support, no following, no defense. That matters because it rules out blind family loyalty. Then something happened. After the crucifixion, after Jesus was publicly executed, after all hope should have ended, the Apostle Paul tells us that Jesus appeared specifically to James. And from that moment, everything changes. James doesn't fade away into the background. No. He doesn't quietly revise his beliefs. No. He steps forward. James becomes the leader of the church in Jerusalem. The skeptic becomes the shepherd. The Jewish historian Josephus records that James, the brother of Jesus, who is called Christ, was executed for his beliefs. That tells us three things. James publicly identified with Jesus. James led the Jerusalem church. And James was willing to die for that confession. People may die for beliefs, but they don't die for lies they know are false. And they don't suddenly worship their own brother as Lord unless something truly earth-shattering happens. What explains the transformation of James? It's not pressure. It's not power. Not wealth. James gained none of those. The best explanation, the only explanation that fits the historical evidence is this. James believed he saw his brother alive again. Enemies admit the execution. Rome confirms the crucifixion. Jewish sources confirm the event. Eyewitnesses proclaim resurrection. Skeptics are transformed. Martyrs refuse to recant. The resurrection best explains the facts. If the resurrection can turn enemies into witnesses, cowards into martyrs, and skeptics into leaders, then Jesus isn't just a figure of faith. He's a figure of history. If Jesus rose from the dead, then he isn't just part of a belief system. He holds authority. Because the one who defeats death has the right to define truth. So before you decide what Jesus means to you, history demands that you answer one question. Was Jesus created? Or is he the creator?